And hello and welcome back to the Social Justice Forums. And yes, we want to tell you that a lot is going on in and around our community. We want to introduce you to United Neighborhood Houses. And for those of you who don't know, it's a policy and social change organization that represents about 43 neighborhood settlement houses serving over 765,000 New Yorkers. UNH leads advocacy on issues including civic and community engagement, as well as neighborhood affordability, childhood engagement, childhood education, adult literacy, and also youth development. For those who want to know, UNH has also recently been focusing on ensuring New Yorkers, and particularly young New Yorkers, have access to a safer summer program. And due to the safety concerns of COVID-19, New York City Mayor Bill De Blasio has canceled summer youth programs, and that decision in itself affecting more than 175,000 young people. Joining us now on our show to talk a little bit more and provide some point of view on the matter, I'm joined by the policy analyst for United Neighborhood Houses, JT Falcone. And JT, thanks for joining us here on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Daren. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, and as I said in the lead, when we talk about New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, Mayor having to make that decision, and we know New York City is not yet in the right shape. But when it comes to affecting young people, I'm a product of the Summer Jobs Program for youth. I grew up being a part of that program. So to have 175,000 youth that are going to be out there without really this access, what does that mean, and what is that? How do you think that plays out?
Yeah, it's it's really something. Across the city, we had providers and advocates up in arms in April when the mayor eliminated summer youth programs from his budget. So we worked in collaboration and coordination with other advocates and providers to raise the profile of these cuts and make sure that everyday New Yorkers understood the implications. But just like you said, we got 175,000 young people who are looking at a summer where they would be coming off of 3 months of remote learning, unanticipated, when the school shut down due to the pandemic, and then they would have no access to any sort of check-in or virtual programming or job programming through these institutions. Like you said, you came up through summer youth employment. A number of New Yorkers can point back on those times as some of their first job experiences and really foundational experiences, and the summer camps as well. So actually, 2 weeks ago, the final budget was passed where there was some restoration of funds. But at this point, what we're seeing is that due to these cuts and due to the fact that the cuts were laid out there for a couple of months where providers were left with no information, no follow-up from the city, we're in a position where the nonprofit community across New York is attempting to pull off the Herculean task of condensing what's usually about a 4-month planning period into 3 weeks to get these programs up and running.
And that's a huge lift, and that requires a lot of work. And so, talk about the organization and some of the work that you guys are doing right now. Who may not be familiar with United Neighborhood Houses, talk about the work that you do.
Yeah, United Neighborhood Houses is an institution in New York. We've been around for a century. So settlement houses are a unique programming model that took root in New York, in America, about a century ago, where nonprofits deeply root in communities and work from we call it cradle to grave, right, across all age groups to provide services for that community. So these settlement houses, like you mentioned, 43 members across New York State. We have 40 members, United Neighborhood Houses in New York City, and they're serving about 765,000 New Yorkers annually. And many of them are running these summer camps and summer youth programs, right? Mm-hmm. So in April, when we started hearing rumors that these programs were going to be eliminated completely, which just for context, last year would have been politically completely unfeasible, right? But in April, the mayor announced that due to safety concerns from the pandemic and having in-person programs, that they wouldn't be moving forward. Now, we found that argument a little bit disingenuous because providers had been working in the months beforehand, since March, to think about what it would look like to run these programs virtually online. And for after-school programs, for a number of early childhood education programs that had been running in tandem with the school year, so not these summer programs, they had successfully flipped to an online model essentially overnight. Right. So we knew when the mayor had announced that that this was for health and safety concerns, that the bottom line was the bottom dollar, and that really this was much more of a budgetary move. But what we did through our campaign, so UNH runs the Campaign for Summer Jobs, which advocates for SY, and UNH also is on the steering committee for the Early Childhood Education Coalition for New York City called Campaign for Children. So these two forces came together under the banner of #FundYouthNYC and worked with well over 100 providers across the city and across the state ultimately to push for the restoration of these dollars and start planning the virtual summer. But of course, because this budget was passed a week before these programs were supposed to go into effect, this means that all of these settlement houses that UNH represents and all of the nonprofits that run these programs had lost really, really critical planning time. So right now what we're doing is we're working hand in hand with those providers as they develop contingency plans, attempt to bring back on staff that had been laid off or furloughed as a result of these decisions, and continuing to put pressure on the city in particular to be flexible because, like I said, 3 months, ordinarily 4 months of planning time is being condensed down into 3 weeks. And we need to see a lot of flexibility from the city in order to ensure that these programs are safe, right? That's the bottom line. We want to make sure that we have enriching programs. We want to make sure that we have opportunities for young people. And we want most of all to make sure that those are run safely with proper social distancing when they are happening in person, because some will be happening limited in person. And then virtually make sure that those programs are enriching, are fulfilling, and are going to keep the young people, most importantly, inside and occupied so that they're not out and potentially getting exposed.
Yeah, a lot that you have to consider when it comes to these young people out there. And, you know, the risk of exposure is high, but yet and still, the program still, still must go on. Going to a virtual format for summer jobs, how hard is that? I mean, some people think like, it's a hard thing to do. Yes, it is a hard thing to do, but it's also something that can also be accomplished. Am I correct?
Absolutely can be accomplished. And I got to say, when I started working at United Neighborhood Houses, because of our members and their experience and their deep, deep roots in youth development, I found myself regularly in conversations as some of these emergency convenings were coming together and we were developing our plan to push back against these cuts with folks who have decades of youth development experience who are saying, listen, there are all kinds of ways that we can bring this online and make sure that the young people have checkpoints throughout the summer, right? That's an important element. For SYEP, ensure that the economic stimulus is still reaching those neighborhoods, right? Young people, particularly young people of color, rely on SYEP in many years, in normal years, to help support their family finances. So imagining a world where there is a recession brought about by the pandemic, where they lose access to that critical infusion of cash across the summer, we really didn't want to see that outcome, right? So providers developed plan on plan on plan, and we continually submitted those plans to the city council, to the administration, and kept pointing to them saying, listen, we know that you have health and safety concerns, and we think those health and safety concerns are well-founded. But if we're talking about virtual programming, what we need to be doing is developing those models right now, and we need to ensure that we have the money in the budget so the providers can rest and not lay off the staff, not have to furlough staff, not have all of these contingency plans in place, because at the end of the day, we're talking about an equity issue, and we're talking about ensuring that the communities that have been hit hardest by COVID, which also overlap in many instances with the communities where SYEP is most utilized by the young people, and these summer camps are most utilized by essential workers who rely on them for childcare across the summer while they're going into work. We wanted to make sure that those conversations were had. And I think the shortest answer to your question is that it would have been a really easy conversation to have if we were having it. The problem is that we were met with a lot of blockades and a lot of disingenuous arguments. And over the course of March, April, and May, when we could have been having that planning time, what we were doing instead was we were developing plans, the administration was developing plans, and there wasn't a dialogue happening between those two groups because of this budget cut that was lying over everyone's head.
Yeah. So what is the biggest challenge right now, given the fact that we've got these budget cuts, given the fact that you got a short window of time to really turn things around? What are some of the biggest challenges that you find yourself facing?
Well, ultimately, when you talk about social services, when you talk about youth development, the most important thing is to remember these are not things that can be automated, right? What needs to happen is there needs to be folks who are working in these programs, who have years of experience, who are really thoughtful, who can meet one-on-one with a young person and sort of assess their situation and work with them to ensure that they're getting all of the supports and the services that they need, particularly in a time of crisis for many of these young people, for many of these young people's families. And so the hardest thing is that because of the budget cut, providers ended up laying off thousands of staff across the city because they had been told by the city that they wouldn't have this funding for these programs. And nonprofits run on razor-thin margins at best, and that's in the best of economic times. So there are thousands of workers right now that are being rehired by their agency, furloughed workers that are being brought back on, and unfortunately, many of them have found other opportunities. So it's the hiring and it's the development of these teams right now that's the biggest challenge. Providers in New York City, nonprofits, human service providers, youth development folks, they work miracles for the city on an annual basis, right? And this is not the first time that we've had some last minute budget dance happen that means that the way that programs operate is going to be a little bit different. And so they're used to this, but ultimately, it shouldn't be a part of a social worker's job to have to develop an emergency rehiring plan weeks before the programming could begin. There's an opportunity cost to that. They could have been developing curriculum. They could have been developing closer relationships with employer partners. They could have been ensuring that any tech issues that might be going on with these virtual programs are taken care of, right? And instead, what they're doing right now is they're working to quickly get folks run through background checks so that we know that the folks that are working in these programs are qualified, are the right folks to be working with our young people, and are ready to go for summer, which, looking at the days outside has already started, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's already started and a lot to contend with. The summer's been, summer's upon us, and it's hard to believe that you got a summer and most people are going to have to worry about staying pretty much indoors and staying safe. Who'd ever thought that we'd be in this place where we are right now in this pandemic? But when you talk about young people, very important, because guess what? They're out from school, technically. They really don't have too much to do by way of activities. And so now with quarantine, now with the city kind of like slightly reopening, there is a need. There's a need for these programs. There's a need for, kids to be active and not necessarily just be at home and be isolated and doing nothing. So I know that your organization, you really work on making sure the kids have programs, but talk to us about the benefit of youth programming and what that particularly means, and particularly at a time such as this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ultimately, let's be clear. The budget agreement that restored some funding, limited funding for these programs, is a small step towards the prioritization of education and support for young people, particularly young people of color, instead of policing them, which is the model du jour. More ultimately must be done, though, because when you're looking at these programs are foundationally one of the most important equity tools that we have. They provide, like I said, with SYEP, economic stimulus for neighborhoods in the way of direct cash payments to young people ages 14 to 24. And for the summer camps, they provide much needed childcare resources for families that are going to work. And in many instances, we see a lot of inequity in the way that the different phases have brought families into work, right? And there are many low-income neighborhoods where there's a much higher concentration of essential workers that saw much harder surges of COVID during the peaks of the pandemic. And those folks rely on a lot of these programs for childcare in a normal year, in a year where they're going back to work and acting as essential workers. So when we're thinking about the importance of these programs, beyond the economic stimulus, beyond the childcare, again, I want to come back to this point that young people have been sitting at home and haven't had access to the same sort of trusted adults and circles that they have when they go to school, when they're reporting, when they have guidance counselors, when they have teachers, when they have their community-based organizations and programs where they're going. If something comes up, if they're having some trouble adjusting, in many instances, unfortunately, we're hearing stories of young people whose parents have both passed due to the pandemic and who are now responsible for taking care of their younger siblings, right? Especially for that SYEP age cohort. And what the mayor's budget had proposed was a summer where those folks would be out on their own. No access, no ability to stop into a community center, no ability to call a community center because all of this staff had been laid off and furloughed, right? And so we want to talk about how human services ultimately need to be a part, an early part of any thinking in response to a crisis, and an essential part of any recovery plan, right? To to pull all of the money out of these programs, to have them lose all of this staff, have them lose all of this infrastructure at the time when, like you said, the city is beginning to reopen. We're beginning to look at what the next steps are, starting to talk about the reopening of public schools. And all of these nonprofits, these settlement houses, have relationships too with their public schools. And the staff that they have running these programs over the summer are the same staff that they would be relying on in the fall to help bring those programs back online. So again, talking about that interruption, that loss of staff, that loss of institutional knowledge, that loss of youth development expertise, that's really, really consequential. And fortunately, we're able to curb some because of the restoration of funds, but there is some that has been lost and will remain lost because of the early decision to cut the programs.
Yeah. So where do you see things going? I mean, obviously a rough road ahead. Where do you see things going by the way of programming, by the way of funding? I mean, when you talk about New York State, we understand that New York State has been hard hit. And so a lot of money has been going out to ventilators for COVID-19. The governor's saying New York State is practically broke. Take that down to the city level, a lot of cuts to city services, a lot of cuts in the city budget. And so when we talk about programming and when we talk about funding, we're going to see some drastic cuts over the course of the next 2 to 3 years. And some analysts have even predicted 5. So in the short term, how do you see things navigating and how do you see things playing out for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for United Neighborhood Houses, we're thinking about that every day, right? It's what keeps me up at night, and it's what we're here to
What
be.
keeps everybody up at night? Let's yeah.
Right. That's right. It's what we're here to be talking about, though. It's my job to be here talking to you about the importance of these programs, because what we want to do is we want to make it really, really difficult for these to be the first programs in the chopping block, right? When we look at New York City's budget, the proposal that the mayor put out back in April, it's a really troubling document. Budgets are a statement of values, a statement of priorities, right? And you're putting numbers to the things that are most important. And the Department of Youth and Community Development, which is the agency that helps to administer all of these summer programs and all of the after-school programs and the programs that I think provide essential youth development supports for young people across New York City, was cut by over 30% when other agencies saw cuts of less than 5%, right? So that really shows where the priorities are at. And it's our job to help curb that and to remind folks across the city that these programs are essential and they cannot be the first on the chopping block, because really the amount that we're talking about is so small in comparison to other budgets. I know there were advocates that were out pushing for defund NYPD, talking about $1 billion, and the total cuts from DYCD that represent all of these programs for 175,000 young people, right, was around 170 million. So when you're talking about New York City's budget, which is one of the largest budgets in the nation, 175 million is pennies based on the rate of return that you get for those services. And looking ahead, we're going to make sure to continue to raise the profile on these issues, continue to try and ensure that when we are talking about cuts, people understand that these cannot be the cuts that we're talking about, that these programs continue to be really, really essential to communities that continue to recover from the hardest surges of COVID, to communities of color, that this is an equity issue, and that nonprofits need to play an essential role in bringing the city back online, because over time it's going to become more and more obvious how many New Yorkers, like you said, for our membership alone, right, which is 40 members across New York City, we're talking about 765,000 New Yorkers who are interacting with these settlement houses and relying on their services in some way. And so we want to ensure that people are thinking about that and continue to talk about that. And we want to ensure that when we are talking about cuts, when we are talking about the fact that, yes, the city, the state, there's an immense cash flow issue. But we want to make sure that those cuts are being applied equitably and thoughtfully, especially given how inequitable the fallout, economic, life, emotional fallout has been from the pandemic already so far, right? We see extremely different and inequitable numbers across the city. So nonprofits are our best way in recovery to help push back and find a more equitable recovery plan. And UNH is going to be here, United Neighborhood House is going to be here, raising the profile on that loud as we can.
All right. Well, JT Falcone, we're going to leave it there. JT Falcone is the policy analyst for United Neighborhood Houses. And thank you so much for sharing with us here on the Social Justice Forums. When we talk about our young people, when we talk about economics, that is all a part of social justice as well. Thank you so much for being with us, JT.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Hey, no problem. Thank you much. And listen, we need you to stay with us too because we do have more show. So please stay with us. The Social Justice Forums will continue right after this.